Comparing timelines between users. A project that's been shared and coded by multiple users will look something like this. The green arrow shows us each line was made by a different person. In this case, all of the users coded for good learning in the video. The slight variation in blue color is just to help you tell one person's codes from another's. Right-clicking over the white space over any timeline will give you the option to toggle on and off various authors. Here we're putting on two different people, Brandon and MC Patberg, as you can see by the arrow. Toward the bottom left of the timelines field is a useful feature that we can toggle on and off. It's called the histogram, and here we're showing a histogram just by itself. The higher the peak, the more overlap between different coders. Here we can see it with many more coders. If we mouse over the peaks and valleys, we can see all of the individuals who provided a code. If you'd like to get this data out into something like Excel or your favorite spreadsheet program, click at the bottom right. Choose Export Histogram, give it a name, open it in Excel like this. On the left will be the name and the starting and stopping point of all codes. On the right will be that same histogram rendered in graphical form. Comparing individuals. Here we have some simple classroom data that was coded by two people, Brandon and John. On the top we see they coded for simply interesting. On the bottom we see they coded good learning. We can export more direct comparisons by clicking on the File menu and then Overlap Statistics. Same timeline data here. Top half of the screen is Excel as we would output that. Note that we clicked on Export Time per Label, and we are able to click on the Excel spreadsheet or worksheet within it as interesting or good learning, the labels or codes. On the table data, meanwhile, we see Brandon and John, the people who did the coding. Let's focus in on this particular data of the good for learning code at the bottom. We can see that Brandon applied the code much more liberally, and he's got two instances coding, of which the first is longer and the second is shorter. It looks like they had good agreement on the second one, however, because John coded that in a similar way. John, with respect to Brandon, applied the code of good for learning 15.16% of the time that Brandon did. So we have John with respect to Brandon, but we also need to have Brandon with respect to John. We'll unpack this in the next example. We can also see that although Brandon and John's codes are similar for the second one there on the right for good for learning, Brandon's codes encompasses all of John's, and thus we see 100%. So we not only have Brandon versus John, we have John versus Brandon, and these are different. Now we switched codes, and we're looking at the interesting code. So we can see right away that Brandon's code encompasses 100% of John's, and John's is roughly half the size of Brandon's. So we're going to be looking to see data that's about 100% and somewhere around half. So John's codes with respect to those of Brandon is about half, 55.58% in this case. Whereas we do see that Brandon's codes completely or 100% encompass those of John. Let's modify that slightly such that John's code for good learning overhangs just a bit that of Brandon. John's codes are no longer 100% encompassed by those of Brandon's. We can see that most of it's covered, but not all of it. 82% of John's is covered. This data type allows us to see to what extent coders agree and to what extent one applies a code more liberally than another. Now you will need to unpack this in any literature you're planning to submit, as it's not a common convention. There's some complexity there. Still, it can help us work toward convergent thinking. If you'd like to do a more traditional inter-rater reliability, please do check out our video on that. That differs in an important way, which is, at the outset, a priori, all instances are defined in their beginning time and end time, and then you're able to categorize them, and then compare the categories that people choose. If you'd like to compare your own codes between each other for conceptual overlap in a similar fashion, do check out our other videos.